This is Tech for Humans, week 3 of Bible and topical study that I've been doing on the place of technology in the lives of people of faith. I'm so glad that you are back or joining us for the first time. You can go back and watch the first 2 sessions that we had together, and please let me know along the way what works with this format of Bible study, what doesn't. I don't imagine this will become the default for me. This way of pre-recording, but it is an experiment. It has its advantages. So yeah, let me know. We're going to talk a bit today about another aspect of technology and another way in which it fits into our lives. And the topic is screens and reality. If you are really eagle-eyed, you might have noticed in a previous schedule that I had originally called this session Screens and Entertainment. And so we're going to start out talking about entertainment. But screens have a much bigger role in our lives than just entertainment. And so it goes all the way really to the heart of how we think about reality. And so we're going to talk about that at an even broader level. And ironically, the way that I want to talk about screens has nothing to do with screens at all. But it comes up because of something that I noticed a couple years ago when I was reading through the classic book Pride and Prejudice. I was trying to read a bunch of classics, and so I read that one. And I noticed something which I must have known. I mean, it wasn't like a new fact for me, but it brought to life something for me when I noticed that in the book Pride and Prejudice and other books like it from that time period, you notice this phenomena of the sisters in the story all play piano, and their playing piano is really important. And I realized that that is the main way that folks in that time period and their social position heard music, because they did not have recorded music. There were no phonographs, there were no CDs, cassettes, 8 tracks, streaming music. None of that existed yet. If you wanted to hear music, it had to be performed by a person. And in the story, it takes on an important role that the daughters in the story learn how to play piano, and both for their own enjoyment, but also they'll play at parties, they'll play just for the family, they'll play for others who really want to hear that music. It's very interesting, isn't it, that was the way that music got involved in the lives of people then. Contrast that to now, where music is just everywhere. You hear music when you're waiting on hold on the phone. You hear it in elevators, in airports. You hear it in cars as they pass by. You can listen to music all day long without involving any other person by putting in headphones and listening to your own music yourself privately. It is a completely different way of hearing music than was possible in the Regency era of England, where Pride and Prejudice is from. Now, the thing that happened, that technology allowed, or that technology influenced, was not just that there is more music to be heard now, which is true. I can listen to music much more easily, much more often than I would be able to without the technological ways that I use to hear music nowadays. But that's not all that it does. And you can see, I think, how our relationship with music changes when it goes from something that has to be performed live, that you have to learn. If no one in your family learns how to play piano, then you won't have piano music in your house at that time period, to now where music is available to anyone all the time. Our relationship with music changes because of this. And it's not all good and it's not all bad. For one thing, everyone can hear music without learning. I would think that is mostly a good thing. It makes music much more accessible to people in different kinds of music. That's a really good thing. It also might decrease the amount of people who learn how to play music or feel the need to learn to play music. Which takes me to an example that is pretty close to my heart in the church, which is congregational singing. It is my understanding that long ago, before recorded music, it was much more common for within a group of people for folks to be able to know how to sing together, because singing together was the primary way of making music, at least for folks who went to church. It was the singing together that provided the music. And so you just learned by singing together how to sing. You sang at home, you sang in church. That was the expectation. There was really no other option to hear those songs, to hear those hymns sung. And so there was a wide amount of people who could sing, enjoyed singing. They weren't experts or professionals. They just helped create the sound of singing. That seems to be on the decrease in most of our congregations. Sure, there are people who study music, who know much more about music than the average person ever did before. But as it has become specialized, there's a lot more people who just don't really learn how to perform music at all, and they don't learn how to sing at all. Singing is left to just the professionals, and the music that you put on the radio or that you stream or that you pay someone to do. And it's less likely for a large number of people in the congregation to feel confident in singing. That is a change that has probably many cultural causes, but certainly technology, the availability of recorded music, has had a big impact on the relationship with people in music, and has had an impact in things like there is less congregational singing. In many churches, and the most popular and fastest growing churches nowadays, the congregational singing is not emphasized at all. The singing is done by the people with the microphones. People are free to sing along, and often do. So it's not totally that folks aren't singing, but the focus has shifted to the performers instead of the congregation itself. This also changes our relationship with music, what it is for, in ways that are both positive towards our worship and ways that are not positive towards our worship. And it kind of depends on what is valued and what we are going for. So again, to say that there is not, technology is neither necessarily positive nor necessarily negative, but that it is never neutral. When we use technology, it affects us and it changes our relationship with the world. Now, as we move closer to screens, this has been happening through the years as the ways of communication has changed from the radio to the television as just one such change in the history of human culture. It changed the relationship with that people had to music, to things that would later become like movies or television, and really to reality. It's one thing to hear something on the radio, and the first folks who did found it incredible. But it's another thing to see those images on a television. It doesn't just help you get closer to the thing that you are hearing or seeing, but it changes your relationship with it and also to the people around you. Now, there are quite a few screens now in our lives, not just television. In fact, in the last study, we learned about how the vast majority of teenagers have a smartphone screen in front of them most of the time. In fact, half of teenagers say they are constantly online, which is almost always mediated by a screen in front of their face. So screens are in our lives. Data just going back a few years now among parents of children shows just how much it has grown through the generations. So from at the bottom of this chart, from the baby boomer generation, 53% of parents said their children were watching TV on a typical weekday. The next generation, Generation Xers, it went up to 57. For the generation after that, millennials, 72%. Now, I would actually not be surprised if for generations after millennials, this number actually went down, not because kids had screens in their face less often, but that the TV was, at least in some part, replaced by smartphones and tablets. And so watching things that are maybe more interactive or maybe not on those same screens. So you can see just the trend that the place of screens in our life has grown. And again, this is not just meaning that we get more content or more TV. It changes us. You can kind of see this happening. Here's a quote from Andy Crouch. If you go back and watch movies or TV shows from those early days, he says, watching movies or TV shows from the early days of moving pictures reminds us just how frantic this attention-holding game has become. Because for screens, for content to hold our attention, it has to do more and more. We become numb to it. In the early days, Andy says, cameras could stay still, and on-screen subjects could utter whole paragraphs of dialogue. And if you go back and watch movies, those classic movies, you'll notice this now. Because now cuts get faster and faster. Colors are more and more saturated. Keeping us entertained is harder and harder than it was before. We are bored more easily than we once were. Something is happening to us who watch screens. The screens are having an effect on us. They seem to decrease our attention. Because folks who watched those early movies had no problem paying attention, following along to the moving faces up there. Now we require, put an old movie sometime if you want to do this, next to a new movie, and you'll see what we're talking about here. There might be a single shot that goes on and on as someone talks and talks in a classic movie, whereas now you're going to cut back and forth between things. Cut. You know what I'm talking about. Something about us has changed in the way that our brains work. The technology affects us in ways that we don't always realize. Now, often, and this is on a theme that we have been talking about, but just another view or another way of looking into it for these past few studies on what happens to us with regard to technology. And if you kind of went to the extremes and you talked about, there are really two views here, two extremes for what this relationship is between humans and the technology, the tools that we use. In the academic world, John Dyer says, there are dozens of theories and finely nuanced viewpoints on technology, but they can be summarized into two extreme poles with several intermediate viewpoints somewhere in between. And he describes them as instrumentalism versus determinism. So in the view of instrumentalism, this would be someone who says, the technology itself should take a backseat to what is going on within the technology, the content, so whether it is the radio program to the TV program to the online program, what matters is the message, not the medium. The medium just comes in to help us get the message across, and it's all about how you use the tool and not about the tool itself. Well, we know that is wrong because we have seen the ways that tools affect us, that technology affects us. For instance, decreasing our attention span the more we use them in the case of screens or television. This is true even with the most basic example. For instance, think the most common tool that John Dyer uses in his book is the shovel. When you use a shovel to dig in the earth is affected, sure, but so are you. You cannot use a shovel without it rubbing against your hands. If you use it too much, then the shovel will cause blisters on you. The tools affect us, even as they affect the world. The other end of this, though, the other extreme would be the idea of determinism, that it all comes down to the technology, that if you use a particular technology, this thing must happen to you. These would be the folks that say, of course, video games, if you play video games for kids, you're going to become more violent necessarily, without really talking about maybe what's going on in the video games or the ways that we use it or maybe how we approach it or talk about it. No, if you use the technology, this thing will happen to you. Now, many people, especially those who have used technology a lot, recognize that this is wrong too, because there is a lot of choice when it comes into humans using technology, how we use it, who the technology works for, these kinds of things. To say that the technology alone is in charge of what happens would be to take out the human aspect. In fact, it would be to take out God's role in our lives. To say that the technology is driving the ship leaves God out of the picture. So Christians especially know that this view that the technology determines our lives cannot be true either. Both of these poles are wrong, although they each share some things that are true about how technology affects us, about how we affect technology. So it'd be much better, instead of trying to shoehorn any argument into these two poles, to take a more nuanced approach. So I want to do that with a group of questions that Marshall McLuhan, he's the person long ago who said the message is the medium, trying to help people understand that the mediums that we use, the technology we use, does certainly affect us. He had 4 questions or 4 aspects of tools or technology to think about. They're pretty interesting. Of any tool, you could say that they do these things. Tools or technology extend or magnify some aspect of humanity, what we do, how we do it. They also eliminate, amputate some aspect of what we do. I'll give you examples of these in a moment. Any tool or technology retrieves something from the past, maybe something that was lost that we can now regain with technology. And any technology can reverse progress if it is misused. So in John Dyer's book, he gives the example of a calculator. A calculator extends our ability to do math, but it also amputates or eliminates the need to memorize multiplication tables. Now, many people don't do that anymore, so it's eliminated something. See, by doing this math, he says, the calculator retrieves time. So it gets back time that we would have had to spend doing these calculations. But also, if we rely on the calculator too much, then it reverses our understanding of basic mathematics, and now we don't even know why it works anymore. You could use these same 4 questions to analyze any piece of technology: what they extend, what they do for us, what they eliminate, what they retrieve from the past, what they allow us to do that maybe we are missing, but also what they prevent us from doing in the future if they are misused. So I want to take another example that is close to my heart, and the last 3 years has been a much discussed topic in churches, a much discussed topic in my life, the idea of online worship, the live streaming. Good Shepherd, of course, does this. We have done this beginning with almost the very first Sunday where we could not meet as a large group because of the pandemic. We could ask these same 4 questions about online worship. What does it extend? The ability to live stream our service extends something. It allows people to worship who are not here in the building. That was extremely important during the time of COVID, when we were worried that we might be harming each other by coming together. It also extends our worship to people and to places who, for whatever reason, cannot make it to the church building in person. It extends the worship to them, to allow them to be part of the community in some way, to worship alongside others in time or across time or space. It eliminates the need to be in the same place at once. We could do online worship with every single one of us in a different place. We could even do it at a different time if we pre-recorded things, which we don't do at this congregation. So it eliminates something. It retrieves something from the past. Well, during COVID, it retrieved something from the recent past, which was that it allowed us to worship together at a time where that had become a thing of the past, when we had to pause from being in the same place. It retrieved that for us. Maybe it retrieves other things too. Maybe it retrieves a time where worship did principally happen in people's homes. By having online worship, by having people worship at home but online, it brought worship into people's homes where maybe it hadn't been for a long time. So it retrieved another thing from the past. This is one of my favorite, and I think one of the most positive aspects of online worship. But what might be reversed if we misuse online worship? I think many people have understood that to simply use online worship as an excuse to not enter into community anymore with others reverses our ability to be together, to have fellowship, to know one another, to trust one another if we never see one another. See, this is a much more nuanced version of online worship than just saying good or bad, or that the technology simply extends what we do always, or the technology determines what we do always. That it's only up to us, only up to God, or only up to technology. No, it's these things working together. Online worship is a great example of this. Now, this has been on my mind recently because a couple months ago, there was a writer, a pastor, a priest in the Anglican tradition, Tish Harrison Warren, who was a very good writer, who had an op-ed in the New York Times in which she said why churches should drop online worship, why churches should stop doing it. She admitted, and for her own congregation, how important online worship was during COVID, when COVID began. But then she says, for all of us, even those who aren't church goers, bodies, with all the risk, dangers, limits, mortality, and vulnerability that they bring, are part of our deepest humanity, not obstacles to be transcended through digitization. Her concern is this embodiment of worship together, that there are things that just cannot translate through screens. The ability to be in one place with all the limits that our bodies bring is so important to her that for her congregation, she believes it is now time, and for others, seems to be what the headline of her article says, it is time for churches to stop doing online worship so that we can regain what was lost in this technology. Now, I'm not suggesting this for Good Shepherd if you're worried that was happening. I think it is a very important thing to think about. It's very important to think about what is lost in online worship, and all along I've been concerned about those things. But we can use some of what we have learned in this nuanced approach to talk about, well, what values are most important, and how can we use technology or choose the way that we interact with technology so that those values remain important to us. It's a good article. I recommend reading it if you're interested in these things. I don't agree with all of it, But the ideas that she raised are important things, I think, for us to think about as we come together to worship. Let's keep thinking about this for a second, but look at some scriptures. Because the way that God has communicated with people has changed through time. In the earliest days in creation, God was able to chat with Adam and Eve in the same place, as if they were kind of buddies. That is no longer how we communicate with God, or at least no longer how I communicate with God. So I want to look at a couple examples to think about this message and medium, to think about how reality is made real for us and in what methods. So in Exodus, when Moses goes to the mountain to receive the Ten Commandments, Exodus tells us when God finished speaking with Moses on Mount Sinai, that time God was in clouds and thunder on the mountain. That's one way of communicating. Then God gave to Moses 2 tablets of the covenant, tablets of stone written with the finger of God. Think for a moment about what kinds of things are implied by this technology that God used, tablets of stone, carved with the words of the covenant, the commandments given to Moses. A tablet of stone implies some permanence, doesn't it? It's not just writing in the sand that can easily be rubbed away. Writing in a tablet of stone is permanent. It shows the durability of God's word. It's also not something that can be easily changed. Once something is written in stone, that's why we have that expression, it doesn't change, or at least not with tremendous effort. In fact, writing on a tablet of stone takes tremendous effort in the first place. You don't write a bunch of stuff that you don't really mean because it is so difficult to carve words into the stone. At least for us, probably easy for God. But by using a tablet of stone, God communicates something to humans. And I would say not just what is written on the tablet of stone, but communicates something in the way that it is given to us. God chooses lots of different ways at different times to communicate to people. Here's another one, maybe the most important way to Christians. God chose to communicate the word to us, as the Gospel of John says, when the word became flesh and lived among us. We have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. What is communicated to us as humans? That God's word now comes not just on a tablet of stone, but as a person with flesh and blood, who speaks, who sleeps, who cries, all those things that we do, the embodiment of the word. That's why it's not important to Christians just what Jesus said, but who he was, what he did, what happened to him, his life, his death, and his resurrection. In fact, the creeds of the church, if you think of the Apostles' Creed, has almost nothing about what Jesus said. The message that he communicated through words has everything to do with how he was born, how he lived, how he suffered, how he died, how he rose again. See, all of that is communicated not just in the message, but in the medium, in the flesh, in the blood. So how does this teach us about the use of screens? Screens have an important role in our lives, and of course we will continue to use them. I'm not suggesting that you get rid of all of them, although you may want to think about where and when they are most often used in your life. But think also about the things that screens cannot do. Screens cannot become flesh and blood. Screens cannot live among us. The messages that we receive from them will affect us differently than the messages that we receive in person through bodies from other people, from God as the Word made flesh. So think about a couple things this week as we close. Think about how we can continue to embody God's Word even while using screens. Because here's the thing about screens. You could say that they completely disembody us, but that's not true because anyone using a screen is still a person with a body, using their eyes or their ears or their both to interact with what is happening. Those are still our bodies, right? It is still our bodies that, for example, in online worship, hearing with our ears, seeing with our eyes, feeling conviction in the pit of our stomach, or having our breath taken away when something beautiful happens. Hopefully, that happens in online worship at least sometimes. Even if your body is on the other side of a screen, it's still your body. So how can we continue to embody God's Word, which we know because of the way that God's Word came to us in Jesus is important? How can we continue to embody God's Word even while using screens? You can think also about where have screens separated you from life, from living. They seem to, in part, do this sometimes, whether it is decreasing our attention span, whether it is allowing us to neglect being in community. For you, in your life, where have screens separated you from life? But then also, where have screens added to your life, connected, enhanced, retrieved something from the past, or helped you to embody life in a new way? If you have answers to these or just more questions, put them in the comments on our Facebook page, on our website below this video, in person. Ask people around you. Let's keep the conversation going. And I appreciate your time. I look forward to seeing you on the next Tech for Humans. Thanks for joining us.